Good morning, everybody. Good to see so many people out this morning. By now you're aware that for the whole month of February we're looking and travelling together through the book of Ruth. You might want to get that ready. We're doing this at the start of a new year because in the story of Ruth we see her have a new start, a new opportunity. And so for ourselves, a new year presents a new challenge, a new opportunity for a new start to do the things of God that He wants us to do. There are times when some of us need a new beginning. If you're anything like me, you have an incredible capacity to muck things up. Sometimes we muck them up and sometimes we muck them up real bad. But there's always an opportunity for a new beginning. And that's what this story is all about. In chapter 1, we saw a tragedy unfold as Elimelech, Naomi's husband, he died. He'd taken the family out of their place of promised provision. His two sons had married Moabite women, and guess what? The two sons, they died too. This leaves these women in a desperate situation. In chapter 2, we saw encouraging signs as Ruth sets out to glean the barley fields in the hope of providing some food for Naomi and herself. She was stepping out in faith. She'd made a pledge to follow Naomi, and now she's living out that pledge. She is going to care for Naomi, and so she's out there gleaning the fields. She was devoted to her mother-in-law and was beginning to demonstrate that love that she had for her in practical ways. We've noted that Ruth is a genuine love story, both at the human level, we're going to see a bit more of that today, very human today, and at the divine level, because in our main characters we see evidence of the sort of love that only God can actually provide. It's an added value love. It's love with a plus, because God's got His hand on it. The love that comes from God is not a mushy, emotional love. It's much, much more than that. In the Hebrew, last week we noted it's called Hesed love. And it's a love which enables us to look beyond ourselves and on towards the needs of others. It features kindness, generosity, humility, patience, forgiveness, gentleness. All of these qualities are inherent in this Hesed love. It's how relationships are built and strengthened and maintained. It's all the good things we know about human love with the added value that God puts into this quality of Hesed love that makes all those things possible. Last week in chapter 2, we saw our main character Ruth, for that's who this book is written all about, meet one of Bethlehem's finest citizens by the name of Boaz. It just so happened that on the first field that she entered to glean, it was the field of Boaz. And it would just so happened that he was there that day and he saw her. We weren't talked about that not being chance at all. It was God directing their steps. The steps of a good man or a good person are ordered by the Lord. Our main character today is Boaz. As we go into chapter 4, we noted that there's a 4-month gap between the end of the last chapter and the start of this one. 4 months in which nothing's happening. And we thought, that's like us. Sometimes we think nothing's happening and God's not doing anything. Where are you, God? What's going on? But all the time He's working. And He's ordering your steps one at a time. You might not be able to see where they're heading, but in time you will. And as you look back, you'll see, wow, God was there all the time. So, Boaz, so much depends on him and how he will respond to the actions planned by Naomi. Naomi plays a part in this chapter. And the name Boaz means in strength. Well, he might have been a strong man, presume he was, but we see his strength and his character. He has great strength of character, and that is going to be sorely tested in the chapter we read today. Ruth is from Moab, but is now living in Bethlehem with Naomi, her mother-in-law. They're both widows. They're both in difficult financial circumstances. We noted last week that one of the keys to unlocking the book of Ruth is to watch for who is taking the initiative, when and why, because it shifts all the time through the book. And in today's chapter, it'll shift at least 3 times, because 3 of our characters take up the initiative at different times. So we ask ourselves, what's the motive when we see that shift? Why is that person taking that initiative? Is it a selfish reason, or is it one that's born of that hesed love? That love that adds kindness, generosity, humility, patience, forgiveness, and gentleness. So, Ruth chapter 3, I hope you've got it out ready in front of you, in whatever device you use. Some of us use the really old-fashioned one. It's called a book, and it has paper in it and printed. That's a good one. I like that one. So then, Ruth chapter 3. One day, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself, and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lay down. He will tell you what to do." Ooh. Bold plan. Verse 5. "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. It's a bit of a worry, isn't it? "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a family guardian." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." Get that? She wasn't a woman of noble birth. She was poor. But she was a woman of noble character. "Although it is true that I am a family guardian, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night. And in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your family guardian, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognised. And he said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl you're wearing," and holding it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Can you imagine what has been going through Naomi's mind? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.' Then Naomi said, 'Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today.'" Guys, I've got to tell you that women know us inside out. What an extraordinary chapter. In some ways, it's quite a difficult chapter to preach. In terms of discerning God's will, for example, Naomi's proposal is radical, to say the least. Where did that discernment come from? Wow. The initiative shifts from Naomi and then to Ruth, and then finally taken up by Boaz. So our discussion will now take up that particular format, 3 sections of this chapter. David Jackman, one of the commentators that I read, broke up the chapter this way, and I'm happy to go with it. Firstly, we have Naomi, who is discerning God's will. Secondly, we have Ruth, who is trusting God's protection. And believe me, that was a huge risk she was taking. That's stepping out in faith. And thirdly, Boaz, reflecting God's character. So let's look at Naomi, discerning God's will. If we begin at verse 1 with Naomi, we note her concern for Ruth. Not her concern for herself, her concern for Ruth, her daughter-in-law. This is a very significant step for Naomi, because when she arrived in Bethlehem, she was completely self-absorbed in her bitterness. Remember, call me Mara. I am bitter, in chapter 1. This bitterness was clearly a sign of depression, a depression brought on by extreme grief. She's lost a husband, she's lost 2 sons, and her economic circumstances are now being blown out of the water. She has nothing and nowhere to go. But here in chapter 3, she's healed to the point where she's moved out of this phase of self-absorption to consider the needs of Ruth. Why are there 4 months between the 2 chapters? Some healing had to take place. Some healing in Naomi had to take place. A cynic might suggest here that Naomi's plan is all about looking after herself. But this would be doing Naomi quite a disservice and an injustice. Her own needs are already being met, and she no longer has any concern about her future because of the blessings brought about by Ruth's gleaning in the fields of Boaz. What Naomi is concerned about here is what is to become of Ruth should Naomi's days come to an end, because she's much older. Ruth would be a foreigner, alone in a hostile country to what her nationality would say, and without any family connection. When Naomi says to Ruth, "I must find a home for you," it's not just about a place to live. The word for home here comes with the connotation of rest. What Naomi is trying to do here is to secure a future where Ruth can be at peace with herself and at peace with the world, because she is both provided for and protected within a family context in this, what is to Ruth, a strange country. What Naomi is trying to do is to make sure that Ruth has a heritage and a destiny, if you like, to live into. Naomi wants to reward Ruth's faithfulness to her by seeing that she is married and will therefore have a permanent home, a place in which she can find familial rest. As Naomi tries to determine God's will in this matter, she observes the law as it's been handed down by Moses, and also observes the character of the two people involved in her plan, Ruth and Boaz. She is relying on the kinsman redeemer portion of the law, which stipulates that should a man die before his wife gives birth to a son, then his brother is to marry her, so that a son and heir can be produced to continue the name of the brother. This practice was carried out through to the time of Jesus, because you may remember that the Pharisees tried a trick question on Jesus on this very issue. It's important for us to see Boaz as a kinsman redeemer. Get your head around this term, kinsman redeemer. Someone in the family that is able to redeem something that's been lost from the past. Jesus left heaven to come and live amongst us in human form, in flesh and blood, just like us, so that he could offer himself as a sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice, dying on a cross, rising again, victorious over death, to ensure our eternal destiny and inheritance. So in Boaz, we're getting a picture of what is to come. He's a foreshadowing of something good in the here and now in the story of Ruth that is for the good of all mankind when we see Jesus nailed to that cross, put in the grave, rise again, victorious over death. So let's consider this principle of being a kinsman redeemer. The basic principle is that if a married man should die before he produced a son and heir, then obviously his brother takes his place. That's how the law was formulated. You can look it up in Deuteronomy if you want to go that far. But it refers only to brothers. The actual law only refers to brothers. Common sense has extended this practice to include the next closest male in the next of kin. Leon Morris suggests that the order would be like this. Brothers, they would be the first cab off the rank, then uncles, then sons of uncles. But note, none of them, because it's not in the law, all these extra people, none of them are under any obligation whatsoever to do it. The brother is, but none of the others are. This sanction is to be applied. There's no sanction to be applied if they refuse to marry the widow. Though they would be not viewed well, they had every right to say no. So in the terms of our story here, Boaz is under no obligation whatever to marry Ruth if he doesn't want to do that. He's already been generous beyond all reasonable expectation, and his standing in the town would not be affected if he said no. He's already done more than could possibly be expected of him. The other thing Naomi was heavily depending upon here was the true character of Ruth and Boaz. The plan she puts forward in verses 2 to 4, and you heard me pause at the end of it because it was such a radical plan, has an element of risk attached to it. Can I say it's a huge element of risk, and I'll try and explain why in a moment. There's a very real possibility that this plan could go very wrong. There's an opportunity here for this whole thing to be stuffed up completely. So what's the plan? She tells Ruth to bathe, perfume herself, and change her clothes. You heard the best clothes in the passage there? Ruth hasn't got any best clothes. She's poor. But she would have worn something clean and something that she wouldn't wear working out in the fields. It's a very symbolic gesture that will communicate to Boaz a particular message. Showing up like this, she is saying to Boaz, I'm finished the period of grieving for my husband, and I'm now available. I'm available. This is intended, of course, to mean that she's available for marriage. But it could so easily be misinterpreted to mean that she's available right there, right then, in that place, at that time. And can I tell you that 99 out of 100 other men probably would take advantage. This is risky. This has got risk written all over it. There's a step of faith of gigantic proportions that Ruth is taking here. There is no biblical precedent for this plan at this time. Neither has there been another one since. This is an incredible leap of faith that Naomi has discerned God's will in the matter correctly, and only time will tell if she's right. Perhaps the closest we get to it in the New Testament is the potential scandal involved when Jesus spoke to the woman at the well. It was just something you didn't do. It had all the potential to damage his reputation because of who she was. But this is quite different. Naomi's suggestion to uncover his feet is most likely included here to mean that at some time his feet are going to get cold and he's going to wake up. She's going to wait till he's asleep, uncover his feet, and of course, eventually that happens. Time is of the essence. It must happen. Whatever they're going to work out here has to happen this night. So we go to Ruth. We've seen Naomi discerning God's will. Now we're looking at Ruth trusting God's protection. The start of verse 5, the initiative shifts from Naomi to Ruth. Please note what this very brave young woman says. I will do whatever you say. I will do whatever you say. Now, to me, when I read that, I heard echoes of something that happened 1,000 years later when the angel came to Mary and said, you're going to get pregnant by the power of the Holy Spirit. And Mary says, may it be to me according to what you've said. I will do whatever you say. Such complete obedience in the face of such great risk speaks volume of the faithful and loyal nature of Ruth. Faithfulness and loyalty both being characteristics of that Hesed love that only God can plant within us that we've been talking about. Leon Morris again points out that these are turbulent times and that even God's people are susceptible to the corrupt practices that accompany idolatrous worship. In the ancient Near East, including Moab, where Ruth hails from, immoral practices at harvest time were commonly encouraged. Fertility rites were the go. Remember, here we're in the time of the judges, when even in Israel, everybody did as they thought best. And most often that didn't include anything to do with God, often with little regard for God and his laws. It would be likely that at this time there were other threshing floors around Bethlehem where much less than honourable practices were being carried out. Threshing floors were placed at the top of a hill. Why is this? Because as they winnow the grain, the chaff gets blown away and they're left with just the grain. So they're in a high place, exposed on all sides so that the breeze can get there. What comes to your mind when you think of high places and Israel's history? High places were where pagan worship happened, where idolatrous practices happened, and many of them many of them were sexually orientated. So what's happening here in Bethlehem with Ruth and Boaz is not what's happening around them, because what's happening around them is too messy to talk about here. In this plan, we've already noted that Boaz himself might misinterpret her intentions and take her on the spot in his human weakness. He's an older man, not yet married after all, and the temptation would be great in the darkness of the night, and he's woken up suddenly and all of a sudden there is a woman lying beside him. Man, that's difficult. That tests your character. You're still trying to come to grips with who am I and where I am, and here's a woman lying beside you. I don't know about you guys, but I don't know whether I'm as good as Boaz. She might have been discovered by other workers before she even gets to Boaz. And although Boaz has already told them, don't you touch her, they're human and as weak as the rest of us. And one of them might have taken her. Whatever the case, although the risks are very high, Ruth follows Naomi's instructions to the letter, absolutely to the letter, and leaves the outcome to who? To God, to the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, Naomi's God, because she said back in chapter 1, wherever you go, I will go. Whoever your God is, that's my God, and I'm going to follow him. So she's being very faithful here. This is an incredible step of faith. And we would all do very well to learn from it. God may lead us into situations that are not safe. God never promised us that when we put up our hand for salvation, that we would always be in a safe place. I can list hundreds of missionaries that will attest to the fact they're not in a safe place. And even today, now, with the pressure building about the anti-feelings towards Christians, we're going to feel the heat a bit more and a bit more and a bit more, and we are not in a safe place. We're certainly not in a safe place when we look at the degradation that infiltrates our society and is pulling us down. So we come to Boaz. Boaz reflecting God's character. Reflecting God's character. The momentum now shifts once more to Boaz, and in verse 8 he suddenly wakes up and finds a woman lying at his feet. He's been startled by something, and the man now has to gather his wits about him to determine whether his response here will be a reflection of God's character or a reflection of the much more common human frailty and moral weakness seen in so many others of his day. This scenario unfolds even better than either Naomi or Ruth could have expected when they first talked about the plan. Boaz not only correctly interpreted Ruth's intention in her behaviour, he blessed her. Bless you, he said. He considered this to be such a gesture of kindness. In verse 10, the word he uses for kindness is indeed hesed. It's the very word, the sort of kindness that is the very essence of the character of the love of God. It's a love based on covenantal relationship. And it is this love that we see unfolding here between Boaz and Ruth. This really is a love story, and they are showing us the perfect example of it in their human interaction, one with the other. This has got God written all over it. In verse 9, we should take note of what Ruth asks Boaz to do when he works out who she really is. She says, "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a family guardian," or since you are a kinsman redeemer. Firstly, this is a clear marriage proposal from the woman to the man. She is asking him to marry her, but to do it honourably, he has to redeem the land that formerly belonged to Elimelech. Remember, they sold up their land and then they moved. He's got to get that back. It's part of the deal. This is really quite presumptuous of Ruth on the surface. She's very poor. He is very wealthy. This does not sit well in human terms. Is she a gold digger? We might well ask. However, what she brings to this proposed covenant relationship is kindness, strength of character, loyal devotion, gentleness, goodness, humility, all of those things that only God can plant and grow in people. You cannot buy those qualities, and he is very grateful for her request. But Boaz too has these qualities of kindness, strength of character, and loyal devotion, and that's why this proposal will work. This is why they were both able to maintain honour and purity in such a tempting situation in the darkness of the night among the sheaves on the threshing floor. There was no inappropriate threshing on the threshing floor that night. Praise God. The word used by Ruth for corner of your garment is the Hebrew word kanap, which can mean wings, and which was the very word Boaz used in chapter 2 when he said, "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." By repeating this key word from his own lips, Ruth is essentially asking Boaz to be the answer to his own prayer. Isn't it wonderful how God works those things out? He responds to this so well and with such generosity. He not only promises to do all she asked, he sends her home with a shawl full of barley, probably double the amount that she would normally take home, already in his overgenerous gleaning arrangements with her. Proverbs 11:17 says this, "Your own soul is nourished when you are kind." There's a good life principle to carry. Your own soul is nourished when you are kind. And both Boaz and Ruth have had their souls nourished in this time together on the threshing floor in Bethlehem. What could so easily have become a messy botch-up became such a blessing because of the faithfulness each showed to the character of God. Enabled them both to be honoured in their dealings with one another, and they were blessed in the process. Obedience is always more highly desired and valued than sacrifice. Write that down because it's important. Obedience is always more highly desired and valued than sacrifice. God's not looking for sacrifices. He's looking for obedience. Boaz has promised to redeem and secure Ruth's future. And in this we see a picture of our own Redeemer, the Lord Jesus Christ, who both redeems us from the dreadful consequences of our sin and who secures our eternal future in heaven with him. We are blessed in the here and now, and we will be blessed forever. Praise God. Even beyond our mortal time frame on this planet. Lest we think that events 3,000 years ago could not be relevant today, consider the qualities of love you've seen in all three characters this morning. Naomi, who discerned God's will. Ruth, who was absolutely obedient. And Boaz, who revealed and demonstrated the very character of God. Naomi trusted God completely for her protection, and Boaz reflected the very character of God. All of this came about because each was committed to the Hesed love of God, which was being displayed so prominently in each of them. And can I tell you, folks, this was unusual, because in the time of the judges, everyone was doing as they saw fit. Everyone was doing as they pleased. But here are two people who are being honourable before God. Lest you think that the Old Testament is no longer relevant now that we have a New Testament. Listen to these words from the Apostle Paul and tell me, if you can, do they apply to what we've seen in Ruth chapter 3? Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It's not proud. It doesn't dishonour others. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. Keeps no record of wrong. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Is that what we've seen in chapter 3? Absolutely we have. This is the kind of Hesed love we are called to live out every day in our every relationship that we have with any other person that we encounter. In our marriage, in our work situation, at school, whatever we're doing in our social settings, are we operating on these very basic principles of God's love, of kindness, of generosity, of gentleness, of humility, or are we just wheeling our own barrow? This is the love God extends to us in His grace and His mercy, and we are expected to extend that love to those around us. That's what separates us from the rest. Just as Boaz and Ruth were separated from the rest of the degradation of their society by the purity of their character, so we are to be those sorts of people. We've moved from the tragedy of the deaths in chapter 1 to the tension of whether Naomi and Ruth will survive in chapter 2, to the even greater tension of whether or not Boaz will be willing to act as the kinsman redeemer in chapter 3. There was certainly tension in the moment when Boaz discovered a woman lying at his feet or by his side. I don't know how much more tension you can have than that. In all of this, we must remember that all things work together for the good of those. Yes, you've got it. Romans 8:28. It underpins this whole series. As we look close, there is yet another hook our writer has placed within this story to bring us back again next week. As Ruth leaves the threshing floor in the early hours of the morning, laden with this generous load of barley, she is experiencing mixed emotions. Ever been in a place of mixed emotions? You've heard good news and bad news, and you don't know what's going to happen. She is overjoyed at the kind generosity in the response of Boaz to her proposal. But he gave her both good and potentially bad news. While he is more than willing, I will do it, he says, to be her kinsman redeemer. He wants it more than anything else he has ever known. Let me tell you, this man is smitten with love for this woman. He's gone. He loves her and he wants to marry her. But, don't you hate it when there's a but? There's someone else ahead of him in the kinsman redeemer queue. Remember we talked about the order of brothers, uncles, sons of uncles? There's somebody else in front of him in the queue. He's such a man of honour that he will not usurp the rights and the privileges of another for his own personal gain. This tells you something about the strength of character of Boaz. But for Ruth, she has to return home with the matter unresolved. What is this other man like? Will he show her the kindness Boaz has shown her? What if he turns out to be a real brute? What if he's a wife basher? There's still tension here to be resolved. We haven't resolved all the tension yet. As Naomi said in the last verse of our chapter, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens. For the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." She knows Boaz. She knows that he's in love with Ruth. And she knows that the matter will get settled one way or another that very day. But that chapter's next week, so we have to wait 7 days. God bless you.